My name is John Pattison Williams. I'm the coordinator of the PHJV Policy Committee, and we have these monthly webinar series that we bring forth for the partners and people across North America. Really, there's about nearly 500 of you on this list, and to varying levels of interest and engagement and of topics that might resonate with each of you. And so we're very excited today to hear from a little bit about grasslands and tracking grassland change, specifically through the Tomorrow's Prairie project, which is led by Nature United, which is the Canadian arm of the Nature Conservancy, and led by Dr. Ronnie Drever. And today also Dr. Bronwyn Rayfield will be presenting for us. So if you could please, you can note down your questions. They're going to present for the first while, and then we will allow time for questions afterwards. And so I really encourage you to hold your questions, and then we will have it then. So I will turn it over now to Ronnie and to Bronwyn, and away you go. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. And thank you, everyone, for being here and for your interest in this project. My name, as John mentioned, is Ronnie Drever. I'm a senior conservation scientist with Nature United. I'm based in Western Quebec in the territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. And it is my pleasure today to share some early results and sort of process details about a 3-year research project that we're about, I would say, about a third of the work into, a third of the time into the work, and it's a large collaborative research project funded by the Environment and Climate Change Canada Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund. And it aims specifically to look at grasslands change in Canada and to project those changes into the future with the goal to understand the consequences of that change for biodiversity and for carbon, ecosystem carbon in the prairies. I will say I'd love to at the very beginning, to just acknowledge that this work I'm presenting on, that we're presenting on, really pertains to a very important ecosystem, but also the home and the territories of many First Nations and Indigenous peoples, including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Dakota, the Nakota, the Assiniboine, the Cree, and the Tsuut'ina. We look to these folks for guidance and inspiration, and also for what I think are some amazing insights on how to properly and conserve these very important ecosystems. So thank you for that. So I'll jump in. Really, what we're going to do today is give you a sense of the structure of the research team, the main focus of the 5 working groups that comprise that team, and an early view into some of the analytical results that we're pursuing. And so, in general, the purpose of the work is to analyze change in grasslands and to deal with some of the data and methodological issues that are probably getting in the way of some decision-making. There are information gaps for effective decision-making about conservation in this ecosystem. And we want to do that both by looking at the past and the forecasting into the future, as I mentioned. The approach is highly collaborative. We really do mean to bring everyone that wants to work on this project with us under the principle that many heads are better than one. And so collaboration is a big part of how we work. We want to systematically compare best available data, identify leading metrics for carbon and for biodiversity, and then parameterize, and this is the work that Bronwyn will be talking about, a sophisticated model of landscape change to analyze different scenarios of change and their implications for carbon and for biodiversity. And then we also want to spend a lot of time in meetings like this one, where we talk about the work, we share it with the community of practitioners, with decision makers, and so to get the word out as much as possible. In general, this is the approach. We have 5 working groups, each based on the main themes of the work. So there's one on a big component on grasslands classification. And if you've worked in the grassland space, you'll know that there are a lot of different spatial data sets that depict grasslands in Canada. And they don't always say the same thing about grasslands are, their condition, um, and, and, and their status. Um, and so that work is led by my colleague at Nature United, Alison Long. And then there's a stream of work on biodiversity where we're identifying key metrics and as to assess a baseline condition that will then be modeled into the future. Same thing goes for carbon. And then we're also looking at socioeconomic drivers of change. And this work is being led by my esteemed colleague, John Patterson Williams. And where we are looking at work done by a parallel project to this one called the Grasslands Learning and Knowledge Hub that's spending a lot of its time and focus on socioeconomic drivers. And we hope to take that literature review and that thinking and spatialize it, if you will, to put into our landscape model of change. And lastly, there's the work that Bronwyn is leading on developing this landscape model. All this goes into what I fondly refer to as the cone of science, on the process of science, where we hope to develop different scenarios based on socioeconomic drivers and to characterize grasslands condition and extent. And then to do so in a modeling period that pertains to essentially now to 2050. And based on the output of that you see at the bottom will be presentations, science publications, publicly available data, and recommendations to our key audience, the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund, to help them make effective decisions about where to allocate funding for grasslands conservation. We also help to use some of these recommendations to help support the community practice in Canada and also in the States as part of other projects with whom we work on with other collaborators working on those. We are, as I mentioned, in sort of nearing the halfway mark on this project. Next year, 2026, will be really the heart and soul of this year, where we will take what we're learning so far and develop the fulsome model of change, as I mentioned. And then progress to date, we have what I think is a very erudite group of very able researchers with recognized expertise in grasslands conservation and classification from a variety of different organizations, from the two federal departments, the Environment and Climate Change Canada and Agri-Food and Agriculture Canada. We've developed a research approach, some metrics for each of our different 5 working groups. We have a list of socioeconomic drivers and a draft approach for spatializing some of these drivers in our landscape model of change, which has proven quite a thorny problem to crack, but I can get into that later. Thanks to Bronwyn, we have is a very sophisticated, the draft approach of a very sophisticated model of change. And then we've begun, as I mentioned, early outreach to the Grasslands and Knowledge Hub, as well as other members of the grasslands conservation community. And that's in large part thanks to our principal extension partner, the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association. And so the team is made up of an analytical team. It has these research working groups and our advisory committee, which I think has at least one of the members of that committee here today, and then a communications and outreach team. And here is the research team in its glory here. So essentially, you'll see at the top the advisory committee with key staff from Environment and Climate Change Canada and AFC. Below that is the person that I'm principally accountable to, my boss. And then there's me as the project manager and principal investigator. And below that, each of the 5 working groups with their individual lead. And then you'll see the names of all the other folks working on this project, as well as below that, other subject matter experts that we rely on on an ad hoc basis to help us kind of talk through or find solutions for some of the thorny stuff that we're dealing with. Okay, I'm going to now talk a little bit about I'll just a little bit about project scope. We're looking at the five provinces where grasslands exist naturally in Canada. So BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. This is the focus really for only the classification aspects of the work. And this focus is specifically on temperate grasslands rather than subarctic grasslands or montane grasslands. And that's kind of the map that you see here based on the Canadian National Vegetation Classification System that we're using to help us understand where grasslands exist in this space. And then the landscape model I mentioned is focusing specifically on the prairie provinces, and more specifically on the Prairies ecozone that I'm sure many of you are familiar with in terms of its extent. And then we were going to subdivide that using other finer scales of the Canadian classification system of ecosystems. And then those are the maps. Those are the ecoregions that you see depicted there. So we've started to build some aspects of this model and to test out the model itself, help us develop an idea of where the tricky parts are, the unknown and unknown, the known and unknown dependencies among the different components of the project. We've developed a pilot area. And you'll see some of the early results from modeling in this area more specifically. It is focused around the area of the Grasslands National Park and the census subdivision that it encompasses. It's about just over 150,000 hectares. So it's sort of large enough to see some of the patterns that we hope to see and analyze in the larger model for the Prairies ecozone, but small enough so computationally we're not taking up too much time to essentially weed out or sort out some of the bugs in the system. We chose this area because we are interested in engaging with as wide an audience as possible, including Parks Canada, who, to us understanding, they're interested in developing carbon models for their national parks in this area. And so that's part of that. We also, and maybe the more important reason, is that this area is a relatively, compared to other parts of the Prairies ecozone, less dynamic in terms of conservation, in terms of conversion of grasslands to other land use types. And so we thought it's a kind of a nice area to see some change, but not too much to make it confusing. So now I am going to switch channels a little bit and give you some details about the work on grasslands conservation being done by the Conservation Working Group and led, as I mentioned, by Alison Long Nebbiolo from Nature United. And so that work has essentially two principal objectives. One is to do a structured assessment and comparison of the various data sets that depict grasslands spatially in Canada, for temperate grasslands. And the other part is to do a structured comparison of the definitions of grasslands used by those different data sets. And with the goal, as I mentioned, to build a shared understanding of why one data set says one thing and another says a different one, and sort of kind of get under the hood of all those changes, if you will. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So and as a principal output of this grasslands classification work, we hope to produce what we're calling a harmonized grasslands map. Essentially, that'll be the output of an extent overlap analysis that we're doing, which will identify areas of similarity among all the different data sets that are depicting grasslands either as tame or as native. And that will set the stage, if you will, for the different parts of modeling change into the future in our model. And as I mentioned, the reason why we're doing this is because there's just a lot of variation in what different grassland data sets are saying. And I'm just going to click first. So for instance, here's some of them. This is animated now, but you'll see just how different some of these data sets are in where they say grasslands occur and what type of grasslands we're examining. So So this is the problem essentially. We're trying to really get under the unpack where grasslands are. Um, and and these are the data sets that we have essentially after a long search uncovered and for which we've gotten grasslands spatial data. And they range in scales from provincial to global. And they each say, I guess I mentioned, not only do they say different things about grassland extent, but they also have different definitions of what's included as a grasslands. Um, and then this is the part where I mentioned previously about where we're trying to reconcile all the differences in definitions. And we're going to do it all. We're going to do this by comparing it against a common framework of grasslands typing and classification, also known as the Canadian National Vegetation Classification, more specifically, the grasslands component of that vegetation classification system. And this is the system you see here depicted. So it's a hierarchical system of nested class types that starts with that ecobiome, which at the coarsest scale, and not the finest scale we'll get to is this group scale depicted here on the right of this tree. And then, so what we'll do is we'll take, for instance, a data set like the AFC annual crop inventory, which has a couple of different grasslands classes, pasture pasture and forage, and this will fit really at this division level. Other data sets, like the Ontario Sensitive Plant Communities data set, gets right down to the finest level classification. And other data sets really just say grass or not grass, and so they're really limited to that very core set of the tree, if you will, the classification tree. And these data sets will be the basis for a synthesis. And simply put, we're essentially going to stack up all the different data sets we have and see where most of the pixels align. And the level of sophistication for this analysis, we're still trying to figure out, but at the simplest level will be essentially just a sum of all the different data sets that depict our grass in any given pixel of our area of analysis. And that, as I mentioned, will be the input for the modeling of projection into the future. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to my esteemed colleague, Bronwyn Rayfield.
So my name is Bronwyn Rayfield. I'm a research scientist at Carleton University, and Carleton University and Nature United have an agreement to do this work together. So that's how we all fit together. And I'll be talking about the landscape modeling part of the project. And this is work that has been done in collaboration with the Landscape Modeling Working Group. So I'll talk a bit about the framework we're using for landscape change modeling. I'll show you some historic grassland change data. We'll talk about how we're modeling the future risk of grassland conversion and how we're going to be modeling scenarios. Okay, so for the framework, I'm not going to overwhelm anyone with technical details. There's the actual references down below. So we're following a sort of widely used framework. And I'm just going to describe some of the key features of why we selected it. So it's spatially explicit and it's raster based. So that means that the landscape is represented by raster pixels. So here is that pilot area that Ronnie showed earlier, where I'll be showing some preliminary results of. And you can see that in a raster depiction of it, we divide the landscape up into these raster pixels, and each pixel is assigned a land use land cover class. So here I'm showing kind of the major ones in the pilot area. So this allows us to produce, spatially explicit raster-based outputs, which is what we want for this project. It's a data-driven approach. We're just bringing in and building all of this off of as many high-quality data sets as we can find, and it's compatible with scenarios. So the types of grassland change that we're going to focus on are grassland conversion changes. So here on the right, I'm showing the major land use land cover classes. So grassland classes, settlement, and annual cropland. And we're going to model changes from grassland to annual cropland. So shown here with the brown arrows. We're also going to model changes from grassland to settlement, shown with the purple arrows. These are the grassland conversion changes or grassland conversion transitions, and this is like the focus of the work. There are other types of grassland changes happening in the landscape. So there's these within grassland changes I'm showing with the green arrows here. That would be sort of a secondary focus for us. And we're also open to eventually possibly including what we're calling reverse conversion type of change, where we're actually having a change from annual cropland back into a grassland state. But that I'm not going to talk too much about that today. That's something we're open to towards the end of the project. Okay, so I wanted to just give you a little bit of a snapshot of the grassland change data that we're using to look at what has happened historically. So we're basing it off of this data set that was pulled together by Darren Pouliot with some modeling that he led from Environment and Climate Change Canada. So this is results for the pilot area, and it shows the decade of change on the x-axis. On the y-axis, it's showing how much loss there was, and I've broken it up in loss from native grassland or from tame grass to these different land use land cover classes. So you can see that there is not a lot of settlement in our pilot area, and in particular, not a lot of recent change to settlement. So there was a little bit in the 90s where native grassland was converted to some settlement, but it's really minimal. We're actually focusing more within the pilot area on these brown boxes. So these represent the amount of annual cropland change. So you can see the sort of amount that came from change from native grassland or from tame grass to cropland. And you can see that it represents the bulk of the change, particularly in this most recent decade, 2010 to 2020. Okay, so that's a little bit about the past in the pilot area. Now on to the future and how we're going to model the risk of future grassland loss. So we're taking this a multidimensional risk assessment approach. So we're in this raster framework, we're using these predictors related to things like biophysical suitability, landscape context, socioeconomic context. And the way that this modeling works is we're building a spatial predictive model. So for each of these predictors, we represent them as rasters. And again, we can have sort of many rasters representing each of these types of predictors. And we also include a response variable. So what is the historic pattern of conversion? That lets us build a spatial predictive model. So in the cone and there, and what it outputs is a grassland conversion risk layer. So I want to just make that kind of clear for the pilot area by walking you through an example of each of these type of predictors and what the outputs would look like. So for biophysical suitability, this is a layer actually that integrates across climate, soils, topography, and it shows the biophysical suitability of grassland or cropland. It was produced by Sarah Olam and Barry Robinson, who are project collaborators with us. And the sort of the yellow orangey areas, those are areas that are highly suitable for cropland based on biophysical properties. And the dark purple areas are areas with low suitability. So, we would expect higher conversion where there's higher suitability. So that's one type of predictor. The next is a landscape context predictor. So in this case, I'm showing that, we might expect that the proportion of cropland surrounding a focal pixel would affect its probability of being converted to cropland. If there's already a lot of cropland, it's likely that that pixel might also get converted. So here we do a moving window analysis across the binary cropland, non-cropland layer. And so the moving window you can see here, we're using as a 3.2 kilometer moving window, which is at the scale of 4 sections. So kind of a meaningful management scale for this landscape. We pass it across this cropland layer, and it gives us this surface of the proportion of cropland within that moving window. Again, predicting areas where we expect higher conversion, where there's a higher proportion of cropland. Okay, so one more type of predictor I just wanted to show you really quickly. This is the type of socioeconomic predictor we will include, but actually we're doing quite a bit of work to develop another socioeconomic predictor. This is just a bit of a placeholder for now, and we'll talk a little bit more about the socioeconomic team's work towards the end of the presentation. But here you can see that, we're just taking the road network and computing distance to road as a proxy for sort of costs of getting your product to market. And so it's more likely to convert if you're closer to a road because you have lower costs. Okay, so that's that predictor. And then the last piece we need to build our predictive model is this response variable. So here, based on AFC data, I'm showing sort of where the historic pattern of cropland, non-cropland was. So we can associate these predictors with this response, build the model, and what it generates is this type of conversion risk surface. So this is like a hotspot map of where conversion is most likely to occur. In gray, I've sort of removed areas that are protected or that are already cropland. So we're just focusing now with the color scheme, sort of from yellows to reds, where is like the most likely future conversion. And so, yeah, you can see some of these sort of little remaining areas of grassland are being picked up as highly likely to be converted. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the scenarios we're going to model. The first is kind of a reference scenario. So it's zero conversion, no further grassland loss after 2025. The second scenario is a business as usual scenario. Again, this is a very typical type of scenario we model. So this is where we drive grassland conversion based on 10-year historical rates. So based on sort of that historical data that I showed earlier. And just to show you what that looks like on the conversion risk map, you can see that, for example, that might correspond to the top 6% of pixels being converted, which I'm showing here in this kind of teal color. So under this scenario, those would be the pixels that would be converted. And we're going to contrast that with a rapid conversion scenario where all at-risk grasslands are converted. And again, just to show you that visually, so that might mean, for example, 20% of the pixels get converted that are at risk. And so you can see how in this fuchsia color, just the different, dramatically different conversion pattern we would get under this scenario. And lastly, again, keeping the door open to possibly including some type of a restoration scenario towards the end of the project if we still have time. So I just wanted to put these down for you now in terms of some conceptual projections that we expect from the scenarios. So these are just stylized trajectories. They're not results. But what they allow us to do is to sort of contrast these three land use scenarios here in terms of grassland loss. So you can see there's greater conversion leads to steeper grassland loss over time. That's what we expect. And we expect that biodiversity declines will track that grassland loss, but that the responses will vary across species. So these uncertainty bands represent differences in species sensitivity to land use land cover changes. And, carbon stocks are also going to decline under conversion. And here we're representing uncertainty related to climate emission pathways. So more aggressive conversion sort of compounds with climate emission related carbon losses. So the climate emission pathways we're considering for this work are sort of a middle of the road pathway and a regional rivalry pathway. And these are to sort of bracket our carbon outcomes that we're associating with the land use change scenarios. So the next steps on the landscape modeling work are to refine our spatial modeling of the grassland conversion risk. I showed you some examples for converting from grassland to annual cropland. We also want to do the same modeling exercise for conversion to settlement. And we want to really work a lot on that sort of the socioeconomic predictors in particular that go into this conversion risk modeling. After that, we want to generate scenario-based land use maps using those conversion risk layers. And finally, our role as kind of the landscape modeling team is to help integrate those simulated landscape land use maps into the carbon and biodiversity assessments that are going to follow. So we're kind of going to help with that handoff. Okay, I'm also going to talk about the carbon modeling. This is work that is being led by Nagar Tafti, who's a biogeochemist at the Nature Conservancy. And this is work she's doing with the carbon modeling working group. I just have a few notes here to make sure that I represent her work accurately in my notebook. So I may be looking down a little bit. So first, just to introduce you to the carbon model that we're using the DESCENT model, which is a model of carbon and nitrogen dynamics. It's widely used globally. It's just very well accepted, and it's particularly has a very strong record in agroecosystems, which is why we selected it for this project. I'll talk briefly about how we're going to calibrate and validate the DESCENT model for our study area, and I'll show some preliminary simulation outcomes for carbon in the pilot area. So this summary of how we're using the DESCENT model to simulate carbon dynamics across different land uses. DESCENT is a process-based ecosystem model that links climate, soils, vegetation, and management to carbon stocks and greenhouse gases. So in the top box there, you can see the key ecological drivers that structure the system. Then DESCENT sort of routes these through the plant production submodels. And in that second orange box, you can see the management and disturbance factors that will also help, that also sort of strongly regulate carbon outcomes. And at the bottom there, you can see that the model outputs multiple policy relevant carbon indicators, which is what we want. So here I'm just outlining how we're going to calibrate and validate the model for our study region specifically. So first we define the scope. So we need to define what the model needs to do. So what land cover classes are included, what processes, make some modeling decisions, and this is all based on mostly literature review. Then we'll calibrate the model using sort of local data that we can gather. So we use that empirical data to align the model behavior to the observations to make sure that our model is working well for this particular study area. And the last step is validation, where we run simulations to test the model performance, and the validation data and model runs are completely separate from calibration. So that's kind of the workflow. I'm going to show some preliminary simulations for the pilot area using just an uncalibrated model. So huge caveat here, just to give you a sense of the types of outputs. Focusing on two indicators. So change in soil organic carbon stock and total N2O emissions. I'm going to compare a simulation where there was zero conversion with a simulation that had conversion, and the conversion represents native grassland to annual cropland under a middle-of-the-road climate future. And the simulations run from 2025 to 2050, so 25 years of simulation. Okay. There's a lot here, but I'll walk you through this. So this slide shows the results of the simulation from native grassland to annual cropland. And the indicator is the change in SOC, so not the absolute stock. What's mapped, though, is actually the difference in SOC change between the two simulations. So for each of those points, we ran two simulations for 25 years, calculated the change in SOC, and then what's being mapped is the difference between those values. And so negative values, well, first you can see that the values are all either 0 or negative. And the negative values indicate that there's more SOC loss under conversion than there would be if that point had stayed grassland. So you can see down at the bottom there, sort of those brighter yellow areas where there's larger negative values. And zeros represent areas where there isn't much difference between the two simulations. The spatial variability that you see in these SOC changes are reflected in the soil properties, so initial SOC, soil clay content, and bulk density, which makes sense. So because these soil properties really affect how much carbon is there and how sort of resilient is the soil to disturbance. So the takeaway here, though, is that the carbon cost of conversion is not uniform across the pilot area. So this type of information is useful because it helps us identify areas where avoided conversion would have higher carbon benefits. So for example, down there at the bottom where the colors are brighter, we'd have a higher benefit for avoiding conversion down there. Okay, last result slide for the pilot here. This slide shows results for the same conversion from grassland to annual cropland, but now we're focusing on N2O emissions. And as before, the map actually shows the difference between the two simulations. So what it's showing us is like how much additional N2O is emitted because of conversion, actually. And so here you can see that all values are positive. Conversion consistently increases N2O emissions relative to grassland. So if you convert, you have consistently higher emissions than if you just stay to grassland. So, and darker areas, then, our larger values represent larger increases in cumulative N2O over the simulation period. And again, this spatial pattern aligns closely with the soil properties, those particular clay content. So this again is like a hotspot map where conversion has sort of disproportionate climate impacts, and we can use this to then, guide our conservation actions. The next steps for carbon modeling are to continue those calibration and validation efforts, so we can get some calibrated model results. Conduct thorough audits of the input layers. As we saw, the input layers really are important to our carbon outcomes. And this last bullet is about some technical details required to be able to run this model computationally in an effective way across our full Prairies ecozone. Okay, I think I'm handing it back to Ronnie here. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Talking about some of the biodiversity indicators that we're examining, and this is work that's being led by yours truly, and the approach really that we're taking in terms of biodiversity indicators is to, as much as possible, rely on existing data. There are quite a lot of different data sets depicting biodiversity, and it is a very complicated topic with many different aspects to uncover. But in essence, we are not hoping to create one massive indicator to rule them all. This is really what we hope to do, essentially be able to report on different aspects of biodiversity that are important to different grasslands practitioners, and we'll do that individually. In general, we expect, because the focus of this project, as you've seen right now, is on conversion from native or tame grass to settlement or annual cropping. Typically, there is a loss of biodiversity associated with that conversion. So we expect most of that indicators essentially to be these kind of decay indicators that will track that pattern of change and will likely be commensurate with the rate of conversion that we assess. And we are going to focus on three aspects of biodiversity: special places, special species, and grasslands condition. So a couple more details on that. Special places, the focus will be on key biodiversity area as one type of special place. And if you're not familiar with KBAs, they are places that identify, as they sound, important places for biodiversity. They are developed or assessed and mapped through an internationally recognized set of standards and criteria developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they focus on things like, is it habitat for a threatened species? Does it have rare elements of biodiversity? How do these special places interact with the concept of ecological integrity and biological processes such as migration or hibernation? And lastly, is this idea, are they irreplaceable from the point of view, like, is this the only place where this thing exists, or is it the only place that's complementary to other places in the landscape in terms of its irreplaceability? And the map of KBAs is shown here. We've been working with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, who is leading the assessment of KBAs in Canada, and they've shared their data with us. And that's the map you see there. So we'll track conversion of these places in Canada, because some of them are protected, some are not. And so we'll track but specifically the places where KBAs get converted in our model. in unprotected areas. Lastly, our key audience for this work, Environment Climate Change Canada, has a map of what they identify as priority places, and they have two types of priority places. One is simply called priority places, and the other type is a community nominated priority place. And that's what you see here. So we will track the area of conversion in each of our landscape simulations that occurs in unprotected priority spaces or unprotected community priority places. Sorry, community nominated priority places. And then we're really interested in this concept of relative rarity. So we, based on our baseline extent map of grasslands, we will essentially tally up the amount of grasslands in each of our ecoregions, and in ecoregions that have a relative, they're in this low, in the tail, if you will, of this species abundance curve or an area abundance curve for grasslands by ecoregion. We're particularly interested in the ones that have low abundance and that are relatively rare in our study area. In terms of special species, we're very interested in species at risk, and with particular focus on grassland birds. Grassland birds are a well-loved taxon that are probably the best studied taxon in terms of grasslands ecology, and for which the data are most robust. And then also they're arguably one of the most endangered aspects of biodiversity in this landscape as well. And so each of our grasslands pixels is going to get a score of the range overlap of species at risk, which is the map you see here. And then we'll track loss in some quartile of that distribution. So places that we're particularly interested in, places that have a lot of species at risk, which you can see as identified in red in this map. And sorry, the output metric will be area of conversion in these high areas of high abundance for species at risk. And then we're also interested in three broad aspects of grasslands condition. A, has it been tilled once before? That's our difference, essentially a difference between native and tame. Then we're interested in floristic differences in composition. And then we're also very interested in whether or not any grassland pixel in our study area is important for ecological connectivity. And for that last one, we're probably going to rely on Richard Pither's map of ecological connectivity and give each pixel in our grassland baseline layer a score and identify places that are particularly important for ecological connectivity and track changes or amount of conversion in those areas. So next steps are really to finalize this list of indicators and do, as I mentioned, give this indicator score and track changes over time. Now I'm going to talk really briefly on the work that John is leading, and so John can correct any egregious mistakes I make in the next minute or two. And so I've learned as a biophysical scientist that it is very difficult to spatialize socioeconomic drivers of change in this landscape. The data for socioeconomic drivers is sparse in general. It's largely non-spatial, and it tracks mostly kind of temporal changes, which we think are associated with grasslands change over time, but there are lag effects, and the decisions of which the consequences of economic drivers are largely sort of farm scale. So difficult to unpack from other farm scale decisions that influence whether or not a producer will keep grass as grass in their plot. This area is mostly private land, as you see in this map, so we're really focused on sort of these private land socioeconomic drivers. This is the fulsome list. There's even more than this to show, and they have kind of they're not always like positive changes or negative changes. Sometimes they're a mix of both. So again, very complicated space to work on, and gives you a sense of why they call economics the dismal science. So more to come on that. I'm not going to talk about that. And the idea is to translate each of these socioeconomic set of socioeconomic drivers into either a narrative of change for our scenarios that Bronwyn mentioned, or to translate that into a pattern that Bronwyn will put into her model of conversion risk, as she did for the example you saw with distance to road. And our next steps are really kind of to continue this dialogue with the Learning and Knowledge Hub on which variables to pick and which ones they're interested in. We also started a conversation with Canadian Cattle Association to potentially spatialize some analysis that they're doing to essentially depict the difference in the economic signal that exists between grazing and cropping at the farm scale, and see if we can abstract that to our whole study area. But I can share more details on that later if people are interested. And yeah, I sort of talked a little bit about the next steps there. Last thing I'll say is that we're very interested in using an open science approach and working on open science principles, using publicly available data, making all our outputs publicly available. We want to make the code available, the data sets available. We're working on a publicly available paper on the grasslands classification, and we want to have a publicly available mapper for grassland data. And then more presentations like this one where we talk to interested people in this space. Maybe I'll just leave that there, knowing that we're running short on time, and we actually are very interested in hearing from you. So, John, I'll pass it over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ronnie.